Hello, my dear students. This is Mr. Shady Alaa with you. In the next video, I am going to introduce for the students of the 3rd Prep her new novel, A Tale of Two Cities, by Charles Dickens. It is a great one, a masterpiece. This novel is full of characters and themes. The themes are too many, like love and hatred, like loyalty and treason, like sacrifice, vengeance, and revenge. I'm going to introduce chapter 1 to you. It is called The Dover Mail. I hope you'll enjoy it. Before getting started with chapter 1, let's have a look at the setting. The setting means the time and the place of the incidents. Well, talking about the time, it was the year 1775 when the incidents took place, just 14 years before the French Revolution. And the place was between the two capitals, Paris and London. In England, there was a great king, and he had a great empire. The king only cared about himself, about his glory. He wanted to expand his empire all over the world. He had colonies everywhere. The English army was the strongest all over the world. All the money and the national income of England was directed to the English army and the troops. The English king neglected his people completely. He ignored them. He didn't care about them. The people suffered from poverty and lack of money. They paid many taxes as well. People in England had to carry guns in order to defend themselves, because at the time crime was so common in England. There was so much crime in England at the time. Let's have a look at the conditions in France, which were even worse than England. In France, the king, his noblemen, the aristocrats, and the relatives, the friends, all lived in pleasure and luxury. They were wealthy people. They had everything. They had properties, they had money, they paid no taxes, they were above the law, and they were enjoying all the rights. One of their privileges was the lettre de cachet, which we are going to discuss later. While on the other hand, the lower classes suffered a lot in France, represented in the mob. People in France paid all kinds of taxes. They suffered from hunger, poverty, illness, and illiteracy, which means they were uneducated. They were dying of hunger and illness. Conditions were very bad in France at the time, and the king knew nothing about his people and cared for nobody but his own pleasure as well as his noblemen. Conditions in both countries predicted that a revolution was going to break out. It's sensible. When people suffer from such things, they are already dying for many reasons: hunger, illness, poverty. What else would they care for? It was time for them to change that regime, and the revolution was about to break out, especially in France. Let's have a look at this paragraph. This is the opening paragraph of the novel. It is a paragraph of many contradictions. Let us read it and then explain what Charles Dickens meant by it. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. Here, Charles Dickens started his novel with such a paragraph to point out to the great gap between the upper class, who had everything, who enjoyed their lives, who were living their best times, while on the other hand, the lower classes lived their worst times. They suffered a lot. It was the age of darkness to them. They had no hope. Everything was completely despairing to them. So Charles Dickens here wanted to show us how, at the same time, in the same society, some people lived the best of times while others lived their worst. And now let's get started with the new chapter, my dear students. Let's have a look at the main incidents of the chapter. In England, the roads were not safe, and the people had to carry guns to defend themselves against criminals. As we mentioned before, there was so much crime in England at the time because of the bad conditions, and people had to carry guns wherever they go. A coach carrying passengers, called the Dover Mail, was traveling one night in November from London to Dover in very bad weather conditions. It was a dark, foggy night with the ground full of heavy mud. The driver stopped at a spot to rest his horses when suddenly a horse rider came near the coach. The passengers and the driver were suspicious about the rider. They were afraid. They thought that he was a roadman, a criminal, someone who wants to stop them by force, to shoot them, maybe, and take their money. So, all the passengers held out their guns, and the driver shouted at the horse rider's face and told him, "Identify yourself, or I'm going to shoot you." The passengers all were about to shoot the horse rider, who didn't appear clearly in the foggy, dark night. But when he approached, he said that he was carrying a message from Tellson's Bank in London to one of the passengers, Mr. Jarvis Lorry. So, the man, the horse rider, was a messenger from Tellson's Bank of London, carrying a message for Mr. Jarvis Lorry, who was one of the passengers in the coach. Mr. Lorry read the message, which said, "Wait at Dover for Mademoiselle," and his answer was recalled to life. Of course, Mr. Lorry meant something by his answer. and you'll know it later. In this photo, you can see the Dover Mail, the dark foggy night, and the two gentlemen, Jerry Cruncher, the messenger, giving Mr. Lorry the message from Tellson's bank. Mr. Lorry was a gentleman of 60. He worked as a banker for Tellson's bank. He worked in both branches, the French branch and then the London branch. He was a man of business with no time for emotions. He was a bachelor, which means unmarried, and he had no time for relations. He was so practical. Mr. Lorry met Mademoiselle Lucy Manette in an inn in Dover because she told him in a message to do so, to wait for her. And then when she arrived, she told him that she had received a letter from Tellson's bank in Paris asking her to come and sign some important papers which concerned her dead father. She told him that she was going to Paris with him. Lucy Manette was a young, beautiful lady of 17, with golden hair and blue eyes. Her father was French, while her mother was English. She is considered the heroine of the story, the heroine of the novel. Mr. Lorry told Lucy that he had received a letter earlier telling him something else, and he wanted her to listen to him carefully, and he started explaining to her why he was going to Paris and what they were going to do along with each other. Mr. Lorry told her that in the letter he received, it was said that Dr. Manette, Lucy's father, and his old friend, who was thought to be dead many years ago, was found alive somewhere in Paris after being in the Bastille prison for 18 years. Of course, this was shocking news for Lucy. Lucy all that time thought that her father was dead, but it turned out to be that he was still alive. Mr. Lorry told her that one of the noblemen used a lettre de cachet to send her father to prison more than 18 years ago. Can you imagine this? One of the French noblemen used this document, the lettre de cachet, to send Lucy's father to prison more than 18 years ago. And now let us understand what a lettre de cachet is. The lettre de cachet was a document, an official paper. It was a privilege for any French nobleman on which he could write the name of anyone he wanted to send to prison without accusation or trial. Again, any French nobleman could use this document, the lettre de cachet, to get rid of anyone he wanted by writing his name on this letter. This person was taken to prison, the Bastille prison, without accusation or trial. And then Mr. Lorry added to Lucy that her father eventually had been set free from the prison, and that his servant found him by accident, took him to a safe place, and was taking care of him. Finally, Mr. Lorry told Lucy that they were going to identify her father. They were going to comfort him, take him back to England, and try to bring him back to life through love, tenderness, and care. Finally, it's time for practice. Here are the questions of Chapter 1. Let us have a look at them. Question number 1. Recall to life. Comment. Do you remember this quotation? Who said it? Where and why? Let us have a look. Yes, that was Mr. Laurie's reply to the message he received from Tellson's bank asking him to wait for Lucy Manette at Dover. Do you remember on his way to Dover when the messenger came and gave him the message from Tellson's bank? That was Mr. Laurie's reply, recalled to life. What did he mean by this? Let us read. He meant that Dr. Manette was still alive and that he was going with Lucy to Paris to bring him back to life. And now let us move to question number 2. The French society was divided in an unfair way, which was reflected on the mob. Yes, it's true. The French society was divided between two classes, the upper and the lower class. Let us have a look at the answer. The nobles, the upper class, lived a comfortable, rich life, while the poor suffered a lot from poverty and hunger, so they became even poorer. Moving to question number 3. The conditions in France paved the way for the French Revolution. Explain. It sounds sensible. There were many reasons that paved the way for the French Revolution, that led to the French Revolution. Let's have a look at these conditions. People were very poor. They suffered from hunger, poverty, ignorance, and disease. The roads were unsafe and dangerous. People paid all kinds of taxes. Of course, these were good reasons to break out a revolution. Let us have a look at question number 4. He is alive. Greatly changed, it's too probable. Almost a wreck. Comment. Do you remember who said it? To whom? Let us see. Yes, it was Mr. Laurie who said it. Mr. Laurie said that to Lucy when he told her that her father was still alive, but he was greatly changed and that she was going to see a wreck of a man. Of course, Dr. Manette, after being released from prison, had greatly changed. He had a great damage. He suffered physically and mentally. He grew older and thinner, and he forgot everything about the past, even his name. That's why Mr. Laurie told Lucy that she was going to see the wreck of a man, not her true father. Question number 5. Write short notes on a lettre de cachet. Do you remember that document? Let us recall it back. Yes, it was a document on which a nobleman could write the name of anyone whom he wanted to get rid of, to be put in prison without accusation or trial. Again, we mentioned before that this was one of the nobleman's privileges. A nobleman could use this document to send anyone he doesn't like to prison without accusation or trial. And that's what happened with Lucy's father long ago. Finally, let us have a look at the last question of the chapter. It's an important one. Let's read it together. Dickens started his novel with so many contradictions for a certain purpose. Explain. Do you remember? Do you remember the opening paragraph of the novel, which held so many contradictions as we mentioned before? Do you remember the opening paragraph which started with, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness," and so on? Why did he use this paragraph? Why did he start his novel with so many contradictions? Let us see. In the very first lines of the novel, Dickens showed us how the upper classes lived in luxury, while the lower classes were leading a very poor life. The rich were getting richer, while the poor were getting even poorer. There was a big gap between the two classes that will eventually lead to a revolution. Thank you, my dear students, and wish you all the best of luck. And this is the end of today's session. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much.